All right, so everyone's talking about how challenging the upcoming couple of years are going to be from a budget perspective, and that means you need to take control of how dollars flow out of your organization. So, how do you do that? Well, it starts with the data, and specifically data on how, where, when, and with what frequency purchases are being made all across your various departments. You may or may not have a procure to pay platform that makes it easy to measure this type of activity, but to get you inspired, you should go check out Procurify's brand new Charter School Benchmark Report. It just came out a couple weeks ago and offers 10 procurement benchmarks from charter schools across the country, highlighting things like average PO volumes, spend per vendor, items per vendor, how long it takes to go from requisition to PO, and so on. Not only will you be intrigued to answer these same questions for your school, it might also shine a light on opportunities for cost control next year. You can go to procurify.com/resources to download a copy or check out the episode description, and we've linked to it there as well. All right, now back to the show.
And when you're a driver of this, it doesn't mean that you're a doer. And one of the biggest pitfalls I see leaders fall into is that because they might be very charismatic and personable and have all the relationships, they tend to overdo but underdrive in the work.
Welcome to Charter School Insider, lessons from the nation's top charter school operators, the only podcast dedicated to the behind-the-scenes business of running a successful charter school. Join us as we sit down with charter school leaders who share how they are overcoming the biggest operational hurdles facing their schools today.
All right, everyone. My guest today is Bill Knous. Bill currently serves as the Director of Charter School Growth for the Colorado League of Charter Schools, where he supports schools with enrollment, expansion, replication, and new school development. The Colorado League serves over 137,000 students and families and 268 schools. Prior to recently joining the league, Bill served as a school director at DSST Public Schools, one of the highest performing STEM charter networks in the country. In that role, Bill invested much of his leadership energy in family and community engagement, as well as building healthy and high-performing teams. Bill has also served as the secondary school principal of Colegio Granadino, a private K-12 school located in Manizales, Colombia. He earned his BA in history from the University of Wyoming, his certification in nonprofit management through Temple University, and a master's in secondary education from Villanova University. In today's episode, we specifically focus on the role of community engagement as a foundation for developing an enrollment strategy. Hope you enjoy the episode. All right, so Bill, talk to us about the current landscape of charter school enrollment. What are the opportunities? What are some of the challenges when it comes to the things you're seeing for charter school enrollment?
So I don't think that we can talk about the enrollment data without also talking about the data around the perceptions of public education. So Gallup recently put out a poll that said that 70%, right, that's 2/3 of Americans, believe that public education is on the wrong track. And interestingly, 43% of parents actually expressed that it's also headed in the right direction, but even that number is down 5% from 2022. And so while this general public satisfaction has dropped to a record low, interestingly, again, parents of elementary and secondary school students often offer very positive reviews of the performance of their child's teachers, i.e. the people who they're most likely to have daily contact with. So when I think about that public perception, I then go to the enrollment data, right? And I think anybody who is in a charter school probably knows the data, right, if you're an operator or leader. But between 2019 and 2021, charter schools saw a 7% enrollment increase. It was drastic, right? It was almost 240,000 students nationwide at the exact same time that public schools saw a drop of 1.4 million students, right? So I remember seeing the headlines and it sort of looked like it was this renaissance. But if you unpack the numbers, right, a lot of those students actually went to online schools. And there was even a tiny drop of about 1,400 students within brick and mortar charter schools. And the other stat I just think that's really important to elevate when we think about this landscape is, regardless of what part of the country you're in, national annual births have declined 16% since 2007. And if you're in an urban area, you're probably experiencing, neighborhood changes and gentrification, and then therefore some declining enrollment or mixed enrollment trends. Rural and suburban areas, there's lots of mixed data, but yes, while overall charter growth and enrollment is on the rise, it will likely continue to be. I actually think if you're a charter operator, there are some hard truths within this landscape of data. And one of these is that trust in public institutions needs to be revived. And I think charters have to be community leaders in that revival.
So it sounds like this is much more complicated than throwing up a chart and saying, hey, look, everything is moving up and to the right. The charter community is growing, things are positive. You're painting a much more complex landscape, everything from there may be less children to distrust in our public institutions. And so that leads me to the big question that we want to talk about in this episode is community engagement. It seems like that is potentially a starting place for reestablishing trust in continuing to grow the charter community. And you mentioned charter school operators have a huge opportunity here to fill that void, if you will. So like when you think about community engagement, I think the term gets tossed around a lot. Sometimes it can be considered a buzzword, yes, we need to engage the community. But when you hear community engagement, what do you think of?
Yeah, I really love this question. So I even went back and Googled, and to your point, there are so many varying definitions of community engagement. Many of them I think will couch it in partnerships between schools and authentic relationships in pursuit of something like, outcomes for students, or it will encompass all stakeholders, right? So those are the common words. But here's actually how I think about it. I think that community engagement is the extent to which students report to their families that they like school and they feel safe. And it's the extent to which families receive clear and consistent messaging that highlights the ways that your school is pursuing its mission and serving their children. And third, I think it's the extent to which people in the community know what your school is, what it does, and how your school sits in the center of the community. And so again, I would just go back for a quick second to our previous question that if at the national landscape level, trust at the macro level is really, really low, but trust at the micro is actually pretty high where relationships exist. Many, many schools, rightfully so, I think approach the question of enrollment, both if you want to expand, if you have a wait list and you're thinking about, wow, we can expand operations, or if you're like facing some stagnant or declining enrollment from a lens of, traditional marketing. And I think all of that is important and right, and we can talk about that more. But I would actually argue today that I think community engagement has to be the frame and the lens by which we approach this work, given where the data is at. And if we frame it that we're measuring the extent of satisfaction from these different stakeholders, rather than just this idea of like a transactional relationship, I actually think that schools can make some headway within this like very, very interesting landscape where we're at right now.
I do think that's a unique approach or a unique perspective because, to your point, it is easy to, when we start to have the enrollment conversation, it's easy to jump to, well, do we have a wait list? No, we don't have a wait list. Okay, what's our marketing strategy?
Right.
More paid ads, more this, more events that focus on driving applications. It sounds like you're proposing taking a step back and thinking about the broader stakeholder engagement and thinking about student to parent, parent to administrator, administrator to other community leaders, kind of perception holistically of the school within the community. What do you think most school operators focus on when developing an enrollment strategy? Like, do you feel like that's a unique approach? Where do you feel like people maybe get their enrollment strategy planning wrong?
I would say in my current experience in engaging with the range of schools and the range of providers who support schools with enrollment, it tends to, again, focus on enrollment akin to a marketing strategy like a business would run, and so that will deal with KPIs and tracking those KPIs through like marketing, email, SEOs, pay-per-click, social media, website traffic. And again, if you're not doing that, I still think I would posit to anybody who's listening to this that still needs to be a component of how you approach enrollment.
Right, you still want to do those things. Yeah. You don't want to ignore all again, those.
It's not an either or, but I actually hear more people frame like community engagement is like what our parent group does, and we like hold a couple of events, but they frame it as separate from the enrollment strategy. And I actually understand why. Again, if you look at the data, most of these external providers that are supporting schools with attendance and enrollment are marketing firms. And they, if you track their arc of when they got into schools, right, most of them got in between 2004 and 2015, right, when charter school enrollment starts to increase drastically, from 2010 to 2019, there's just this exponential rise in the number of schools, the number of students attending these schools. And I think that the marketplace was like, well, we can help schools. And again, a lot of what they're promoting is this idea of like a small business private marketing approach. But again, I would call us all back to the fundamental fact that charter schools are free and public organizations by and large. And so I really think we need to potentially reinvest our focus in this community engagement approach, which has marketing as a component, but I would argue sits as like a higher arc and is like an umbrella that goes over that. And we can talk about this a little bit more, but I actually think there are lots of ways to take KPIs and fold those into how we think about community engagement. But again, the frame is a little bit different. In particular, so many parents right now have just a distrust or a misinformation, or they're unclear because of how they're receiving their information. And if we take a traditional approach that is pre-pandemic and try to fold it into this, I think some operators, some schools, right, could be facing anything from stagnant enrollment to closure, or worse, that some schools that could expand and serve more students that right now are being underserved, that don't have access to choice and opportunity, they're not going to get that. And so I actually think that there's a call to action here that we really have to go back to why we exist and why we do this work. And I think at the root of it, most charter schools do really, really good work in engaging communities and what they're passionate about and what they're looking for in terms of how their kids are being served. And whether, again, it's increasing or expansion, this frame shift is just really, really important.
If we take a first principles approach to developing an enrollment strategy and thinking about community engagement, like if we're going to ask the fundamental questions, whose job is it to drive enrollments? Like you mentioned, people think that there's this parent resource group and they are kind of, get pegged as their job is community engagement. They host a couple of social events. Maybe the marketing team is really focused on those KPIs that
right.
we were talking about, that sort of private business approach to driving enrollments. But at the end of the day, like from your perspective, whose job is it to think about driving enrollments or developing a community engagement strategy that is the foundation of the enrollment strategy?
I just deeply love this question. I made huge mistakes as a school leader in my first couple of years in the game and got much better at it through some really good development. And so I would say it is absolutely essential and critical, right, that the school leader, regardless of what their title is, but whoever serves as the number one in the school, right, is the driver of enrollments. And the reason I think that that's important, Daniel, is when I think about the principle of extreme ownership, this is the kind of work that can fall to the wayside very, very quickly, because anybody who's listening understands how deeply challenging it is to consistently run great schools. And so because time and energy is such a finite resource, this is the kind of work that can become very reactive when data starts to show up that suggests that enrollment's declining or that achievement is stagnating. And so I think that there has to be some strategic effort that is grounded in the school leader thinking about what gets measured is what's going to matter, and like, what are we measuring? And when you're a driver of this, it doesn't mean that you're a doer. And one of the biggest pitfalls I see leaders fall into is that because they might be very charismatic and personable and have all the relationships, they tend to overdo but underdrive in the work. In driving from a place of extreme ownership, I think in this place is a lot of behind the scenes. It's a lot of positioning, a lot of empowering. And that, there's a whole host of things we can talk about here, but I would guarantee in 99% of cases at schools that there are rock stars in waiting who can do some of this face-to-face work, right? Because community engagement, I think at the end of the day, relative to the definition I gave earlier, it is a question of relationships as they mean to the end of how people are experiencing the environment. And school leaders should certainly be front and center in certain spaces, but by and large, right, because you're probably spending 6 to 8 hours a day in classrooms and meetings, at least, in addition to all of your other work, you really need to be thinking about who are the other people you're going to be positioning to be tracking data, to be interfacing with families, to be promoting events, et cetera, et cetera. And if those pieces are not codified and in place and those people don't feel a sense of extreme ownership, I would argue you're not driving really anything. You're just being reactive to challenging data. And that's probably showing up in other ways that you're running your school, which is a deeply, deeply challenging place. But again, in this particular landscape, the charge is on the school leader to drive at a really high level here.
It certainly tends to fall to that most senior level
administrator, whether it's the principal at a campus or the superintendent or chief of schools, to be, the face of the organization. And it sounds like what you've observed or experienced is the fire department analogy of you don't appreciate your fire department until your house is on fire, and then you're calling them in a panic, as opposed to, proactively putting measures in place where you have a holistic approach to reducing fires in your neighborhood or something like that. You mentioned as a leader not needing to own doing all the things, not needing to personally be the one that does everything, but rather driving the work. So you mentioned personally, you learned a lot of lessons in this area in your first couple of years as a school leader. What are some tactical recommendations to think about empowering other leaders or maybe dormant leaders that you referenced at your school, at your organization, to help cultivate this kind of like holistic community engagement enrollment strategy approach?
Well, first off, I love the fire department analogy. My dad was a firefighter, and one of the things that we would always talk about is the importance of clear roles and responsibilities is how you keep people safe. And then within that, I think that you're always going to find leadership when you've empowered people to do the right job. And so some key lessons I think about from that frame of what it looks like to structure and staff, and then leverage some wisdom. A couple things come to mind. I mean, I know that anybody who is looking at enrollment has data sets in front of them. And most of those data sets, right, are probably going to fall with like funnel conversions and figuring out how to take people from initial engagement to a conversion rate, or like having some onboarding persistence metric. But I would argue that you already have a base of families that are there. And most schools, while they're doing family surveys, that there is some really tried and true methods around particular types of surveys that Gallup runs that can help you figure out your net promoter score, your NPS, which is a commonly referred to metric right now. Staffs are giving it to their organizations, but families can give really, really valuable feedback on what resonates with them and what challenges they're experiencing. And that data often gets collected if it's there. So if you are collecting that data, good on you. But I would say that there is a delta between the good and the great schools right now, between who is acting on that data very actively in a way that their community knows and can see that. And this data can not only be used to keep existing families that might be thinking about otherwise transitioning, but also inform future marketing and enrollment efforts as you're thinking about engaging feeder schools and going to community events and talking about what your value add is and what your brand awareness is at schools, because it's been unpacked from what the community is telling you about their experience within the data. So again, one high level, I would say, if you don't have a codified system for collecting net promoter scores and you don't have extreme ownership with somebody on your team to like run that, look at that, respond to that feedback through social media and family means, that is a really, really easy, low lift opportunity to take advantage of. You can borrow most of that brilliance and you just need to plug it into a system. Two, I would say, again, I mentioned this earlier, but I cannot stress enough, and I made this mistake for years, the over owning of the lift, the doing versus the driving. You miss the opportunity to empower people's superpowers in this space. There are people in your building, and they might not be staff. They might not even be parents. The biggest missed opportunity is that the kids are there, and they are by and far away the best promoters of the experience. Now, how you position them to share their story authentically, right? This could be, you might be thinking about, well, I have a K-5 school that's a single site in a rural area. I would still trust your instincts about how to authentically represent that child's narrative and what their experience is in a way that other families or even kids might see that and be like, hey, that's intriguing to me, because that, the one-to-one, the seeing yourself in the potential audience that you're thinking about joining is by and far away one of the biggest levers that good schools are pulling on right now. Because traditionally we've gotten like the leader or a parent to get up there, and that has value. And I would actually say the biggest underutilized sort of marketing effort within this idea of community engagement is to position your students to talk authentically about their experiences. Every single time I did this as a school leader, where we brought students in, we had them lead tours, the parents would leave and say, I want my son or daughter to have time with that kid when they go to whatever school or university. right? Every school has these kids. They're there. They love to be empowered to do this. And again, I just think that the true action is on the leader to stop and pause and say, who is the best individual within this community that's positioned to do this type of particular community engagement work that's in front of us right now. Third thing I would say really quickly is just like, I think that there is a lot of symbolic leadership that is within a leader who's willing to say, this is the reality of our landscape. This is the data that's in front of us. And these are the 1 to 2 things we're going to do. Again, every school leader right now is grinding and working extremely hard and facing a range of challenges. And I know, I mean, I remember sitting there being like, wait, we have a waiting list and we now need to go out and we need to try to get more people. Like, this can't be the priority. But at the end of the day, the reality is that even if it's not this year or next year, there's some shift in your enrollment trends that is coming. And you want to try to get ahead of it by establishing a culture and structures, right, that position other people to lead that work, even if by chance you're not in the position a couple of years from now. So I really think at its highest level, this is a leadership challenge, and there are a number of tried and true ways, even beyond what I've referenced here, that people can leverage and really drive the community engagement efforts to increase and expand enrollment and opportunity.
Super tactical advice. So, kind of recapping that, we've got 1, start with the data, get a lay of the land, maybe develop an NPS, Net Promoter Score for your school. 2, be a driver, not a doer of everything. The leader doesn't have to personally own it all. They can empower their staff, look beyond yourself and maybe other administrators to, leaders in waiting. And then 3, kind of developing that long-term framework so that when those enrollment trends, good or bad, come, your school is prepared. So if I'm a school listening and maybe I've tried components of those things, the next question that comes to mind for me would be, like, when you implemented those things, how do you know if these efforts are working? Like, do you develop KPIs on a 3-month horizon, 6-month horizon, 18-month, 5-year? How frequently are you communicating with the rest of your leadership team on how the enrollment strategy is going? Like, how do you think about quantifying these things we've talked about, particularly when it comes to community engagement, which may be a little bit harder to measure as opposed to some of those, marketing KPIs?
Yeah, I would say there are 2 large buckets I would think about. I would name vulnerably. Years ago, I didn't do any of this, and it was taught to me by really, really wise leaders, and I found it to be just extremely invaluable because it did the following. Once we clarified the arc, the what, the how, and what we were measuring, it really just saved a lot of cognitive energy and made it a lot less daunting to try to figure out how to tackle these really complex challenges. Because when you're facing enrollment challenges, right, we just want to call out what's real. You're also facing budget challenges in some way, shape, or form. And that gets really real and it feels existential. And like that is not a place to be operating from as a leader. So I would just say that if you're not there yet, be kind to yourself. This is learned and learnable material. And here's what I would share. I think you got to have components to put together a plan. And those components would be a playbook that codifies ownership, roles, responsibilities, timeline. 2, an arc of the year. We would often measure this quarterly, even though that our school operated on trimesters. That would allow us to operate within the enrollment landscape of our district and our state. You may have a different timeline relative to, your school calendar and then your district's timeline for how they approach enrollment. But I would say by and large, most schools, I think quarterly is probably a tried and true best practice and a place to start from. And again, a lot of this, there's so many, playbooks. And if anybody is listening to this and is curious, again, happy to share a lot of the information and the playbooks that we build at any point. From there, I would say there's actually a lot of ways to measure a lot of this. Again, we sort of name the KPIs that exist in marketing. And I would say you can measure a lot of inputs, inputs being how many staff PDs am I running on this? How many community events am I hosting? How many community events are we attending? What are our feeder school visits? What about shadowing participation goals for any type of transitional grade into the school? Open houses. that's all within the sort of like community outreach and engagement and prospective families. Additionally, I think you could look at things like your parent group attendance goal. How many parents are actively attending whatever type of parent function, whether it's a PTA or any other type of advocacy group? What does that look like? And then how do you get small increases in that? Increasing positive student perception goals. A lot of schools will give surveys. Again, even if you have a K-5 school, I think that there are ways to gather very, very specific data with a very, very short number of questions that can be valid and reliable. One thing that some schools are doing really, really well, particularly in a charter community, is they're positioning themselves as advocacy organizations, to simply say, we're going to promote voter registration. And it's not about what way people vote, but it's simply saying like civic engagement's really important. A lot of this is publicly available data, right? And they'll talk to their school teams about the number of people that were registered to vote, and they'll talk to their communities about how to get out and make their voice heard in community forums. And then there's just an infinite number of ways to measure online engagement. One other thing I would name that we can just measure within the enrollment facets within this like community engagement playbook is community demand. Really, really important to try to understand, even beyond your specific enrollment metrics and your seat offerings, what is the overall percentage of the market that's out there that wants access to your seat? And then how does your particular enrollment system, whether it's a lottery or whether it's like a school choice system like we have here in Denver or some alternative, how do you understand what the community demand metric is? Most of the time, this can be provided to you within your district or your authorizer. Your transition grade retention goal, we see this so many times, right? 5th to 6th, 8th to 9th. Kids leave schools at transitions, especially if you're in one of these, schools that has like a K-12 or a K-8 operation or a 6-12. And keeping kids between those transitional grades is probably one of the highest leverage, lowest lift things you can do to build strategies around. We talked about the NPS, and then again, I think the family engagement survey participation is really important, as well as seat offer and onboarding persistence. So, that's a laundry list of different ways to measure. So I would maybe just push a little bit, and I've heard this a lot of people being like, community engagement is like a qualitative approach. Yes, and again, like this both end idea, I actually think that there's a lot of ways that you can measure the quality of that approach through both inputs and through outputs.
Today's episode is sponsored by BuyQ. BuyQ is the only group purchasing organization dedicated to serving the charter school community. Over 4,000 schools participate in BuyQ's purchasing program, which is free for schools and offers competitively sourced contracts from industry-leading suppliers like Staples and CDW Education. If you'd like to learn more about BuyQ, schedule a free purchasing strategy session with our team today by heading over to www.buyq.org/signup. That's BUYQ.org/signup. All right, now back to the show. Take us inside one of these quarterly meetings. So you mentioned all of the different metrics that one could track. Doesn't mean you have to track all of those, but you could take a look at, okay, here's our inputs, KPIs, and if we know we're doing these inputs, then let's see what happens 3 months later or 4 months later. So when you would sit down with your team, or if you've observed other teams doing this, like who is in that meeting? What does that meeting look like? What happens when the data maybe is not positive or maybe is super positive? How do you feel like leaders can kind of execute on an iterative process and not make this here's our community engagement strategy for the year. It's going to help us get enrollments. These are our goals. And then at the end of the year, you're looking at it and you're like, well, we did okay. And now we're back to drawing up a new plan for the next year. Yeah. Talk us through like what one of those meetings might look like, hypothetical or actual examples.
Let's think about, because it's August, or now September. So we'll talk about if I were running one of these meetings at this time. First and foremost is I've already sort of established clear roles and responsibilities and lanes of ownership. For us, when, I was a school director at DSST Public Schools. I ran the 9 to 12 campus. We had 550 kids, about 65 staff members. The full team of folks who I would have there would be like a front office manager, over time begin to staff what we call a community engagement manager who's responsible for enrollment. School director, a couple of folks from the leadership team, and then folks from our parent advocacy groups. Sometimes we would partner with the middle school, sometimes we would do it separately, but that meeting would be anywhere from 5 to 8 people, and then somebody from the home office who could give us a high level understanding. I'd be looking at one, like at this time of the year, establishing a cadence and like regrounding the vision for this team. establishing a foundation for strong connections with our community feeder schools and our family groups. Again, we're already thinking about the existing relationships we have and then those that we want to build with the feeder schools. We would socialize our goals and our expectations for staff involvement and work amongst the community. So we'd be looking at the calendar for PD and then how some folks out of that meeting could be like leveraging the talking points that we would have already aligned on. And then we would establish a plan to incorporate community partnerships that semester. So that might be leveraging the first round of report cards and bringing in 5 to 6 community partners based upon parent feedback around, for us, it was usually things around dentistry, taxes, healthcare, and then anything that was around the COVID, right, was just around like vaccines. And so we would bring in those partners and we would just get a huge response because we were acting on the community feedback that we had already asked for. I think additionally, right, what you're looking at is once you establish all of that, run your first round of events, your first round of data, and then like your key benchmarks, which for us would usually come in November. And at that point, we'd be looking at feeder schools, doing any type of transitional work, and then really beginning to track the initial community demand, because for us here in Denver, right, our school choice window that all families have access to would open up in January of that year. So we'd be looking to have our plan in place. I'm talking about all this, right, from a lens of having already had codified an arc of the year. So again, I would just take a step back maybe to your question and say, the reason that I'm able to answer a question about what we would do is that we knew what we wanted to do at every point in the year, right, per that sort of quarterly focus. So that would be a key starting point to know where you want to begin. And again, if you're listening to this call and you're like, we're not even there, so where do we start? Pick 1 to 2 things based upon what you know that you are doing well and where you need to kind of improve. Everybody has things that they can try to refine. And again, I would figure out in particular who on the team is going to own what, and then how do I drive that work given the data that I have access to right now. This is an iterative process. I mean, I'll just, I hope some of my former colleagues are listening to this. If I went back to my work in 2017, we had this very ad hoc committee that we had pulled together of like-minded, passionate folks, and we didn't have any clear roles and responsibilities. And a lot of our agendas were really brainstorming, and it was fun, but we didn't really drive to outcomes. And that felt challenging, right? Because we were putting in a lot of time and energy. But once again, we had a codified structure and clear roles and responsibilities, and we began to like allocate some budget because we had clarity. We just had vastly different outcomes in terms of how we spent time and in terms of what our data told us about what our community was experiencing. We had a wait list the entire time. However, the data in Denver is very clear that demographics are going to shift. And so we were wise enough to listen to feedback that said, if you don't get ahead of this now, you're going to be doing it at a point where you might not have the bandwidth to. So again, I would just say that wherever you are at in your arc, wherever you're at relative to what your landscape is saying, progress over perfection is the most important mindset to take into this work. It is not easy to overhaul everything in a day, but there are any number of low lift, high level things that you can borrow brilliance around and implement very quickly without a ton of like, how is this going to work and what is this going to mean? Because everybody in the school landscape is facing this question right now. There's not a school that's sitting there.
That unique.
Even if they have, it's universal. And so I would just find your place within the universality and say, what can I do within my locus of control to really drive this work?
And hopefully, maybe if you're in the exact same town, there might be a little bit of competition, but hopefully there's also a willingness to share best practices. And you've shared a ton of tactical advice here. I think something we always do is encourage others to say, hey, if you don't want to talk to someone who's in the exact same town as you because you feel like you guys are competitive, go talk to someone in the city a couple hours away and hear how they're doing it. And I think there are some really unique ways people are approaching this across the country. One other question that, as you were talking through kind of your work and progress with your team, and you kind of created this tiger team of individuals that are owning different aspects of this, how do you think about sharing progress back to the community? Meaning like reflecting the work that has been done positively, or, the flip side of that, if things aren't going well, but you have people in the community that love the school, how do you reflect that to them to get additional buy-in and support?
Qualitative and quantitative are the first two things that come to mind. And what I would say is anytime within a community engagement frame that you're actually engaging, usually what you're engaging with is two-directional communication. So it's not just sort of one directional, I blasted it on social media, I got a couple likes. you're actually talking to people, and therefore you're actively listening to things that they are mirroring back to you about either their concerns or their hopes and their dreams, or even their affirmations about, what their child or, some connection they have to the school, what they're experiencing. And I would say the biggest missed opportunity, I probably missed 100 of these. In the last 3 years of my time as a school director, what I got better at, and I just saw a ton of resonance with, was taking the quoted language of anybody that I connected with, whether it was positive or not, and I would mirror it back to my community, that particularly the folks who were on the ground doing the work, and even the larger staff, through our standard means. And so, we had a staff newsletter, we had weekly meetings, we had a staff chat, and I would find, places to be able to just say, hey, this is what this family member said about that. And I cannot stress enough how valuable that is, particularly when people are in the storm of a day-to-day work at a school, to just see some words from a parent, whether they're prospective or current. So that has a ton of value. Two, I would say, quantitatively, once you begin to collect metrics, it can be very, very empowering. Say that you've run a short door knocking campaign or a little phone bank to try to drive some last minute engagement before, any type of a lottery or a school choice or an enrollment window. Mirroring back that data to folks and saying, hey, we made X number of calls, we got X number of responses, and then we had X number of people attend an open house or a recruitment fair. That data goes a long way. Again, just internally, I would see this massive increase in clicks or likes within our internal messaging system when I would put that out. And let me take a step back. When I got really good at it, I wouldn't even do this, and everybody else would be doing it for me. And those people would get way more resonance than I would as the school leader. So again, I just,
Right.
I would, to tie it all together, I think that anytime that you're engaging, you're listening for what is the key piece that I can bring back to my team to show them this work matters. It can be a quote, it can be a data point. It does not need to be complex, and it's always there. It does, and even, there were some points where we even said, hey, some families told us that this is what they were frustrated about, especially around hot button issues like, if you're in an urban high school or probably anywhere, vaping is probably a universal problem right now. School safety, guaranteed universal. And that kind of stuff resonates with teachers who are also in the building, right? And they're seeing the sort of same thing that parents are. So I would overshare, I would capture, and I would find the means and the ways within your structure, ideally to be able to position other people to do it, or for you yourself to take the symbolic lead on that. It goes a tremendously long way towards keeping this community engagement effort top of mind and showing folks the value of their efforts on the ground.
Right. There is that kind of momentum factor when, particularly on the positive side, when you can share with that immediate group that's focused on community engagement, they're then sharing positive things parents have said to teachers. Teachers are then encouraged because their job is really hard. And it's great to hear a parent say that they appreciate their efforts so much. And it kind of, all tides rise together, it sounds like, when you are being intentional about capturing some of that sentiment. All right. So kind of a more forward-looking question as we wrap up here. So I think the hot button issue, at least in the ed tech space, but certainly at most of the education conferences I've been to thus far, is everyone's talking about AI. What's the role of AI? How is it going to change the landscape of education? And so in this conversation, a lot of people are talking about how AI is going to change marketing, and a lot of people are talking about how AI is going to change communication. What are your thoughts on sort of the intersection of things that are happening with AI language models and community engagement? Is there any sort of, play there for schools? Should schools be concerned? How should schools think about, either leveraging these tools, or is it something that you don't see playing a factor in this bigger conversation around community engagement, enrollment strategy?
Yeah. I've so many thoughts, like so many people in the space right now. I would say, for starters, this feels very much like a space where, without clear alignment, policies, and agreement on practices, right? I would just say every single school or CMO is going to need to figure out what is their generalized approach to AI. And I think, we can sort of separate how students are going to be engaging with it for this particular conversation, although I think that's important. I would actually argue, because time and energy are such finite and valuable resources, I think AI might be one of the biggest hidden value assets and tools that's out in the marketplace right now in terms of how it can streamline, protect, and give back some energy for the following reasons. In its best form, it can automate communications, it can analyze it like a ton of big data sets, and it can do some personalization of outreach once you learn the prompting around it. And I think it's there to complement, not replace, the genuine human interactions and relationships. I don't want to say that pedantically, but I assume most people know that. But if it's thought of as like, oh, like it can do all of our email outreach, that's not the play, I would say. But I do think it can streamline the processes that exist. Because again, having generated, for example, if you read that NPS survey and you want to go through and analyze all the key takeaways, if you have that skill set and you can do it in a short period of time, great. Or if somebody on your team can, great. But this tool can do it in a couple minutes, and you can then take that back to your team and improve upon that and say, what's right and wrong about this? And so I would use it as a tool to take the initial stab at drafting really anything when it comes to external or internal facing communications, and then putting a personalized, refined touch within, your final messaging as the owner. It can save time and energy. And certain schools, there's some folks like KIPP Texas has been doing a lot of really good enrollment work. IDEA out of Houston, CEC in Colorado. And I don't know to the extent that all these schools are necessarily using AI, but their external facing communication is strong and their community engagement is really good because they figured out a way to, I think, both merge how they think about enrollment with community engagement. So I would just argue for everybody to be thinking about, how do I use it? Where's the value add within my current work streams? And who's the right person on my team to help figure this out if it's not me? I guarantee that somewhere within that question, there's some real time and energy that can be given back in some drafted products. They're still going to require refinement because they can't be the final thing. But that's really valuable right now. And that didn't exist 3 years ago.
Right.
So I would not overstate that. There's one other quick tangent, if we have just a minute to go back, a thing that I didn't touch upon that I just wanted to. When I zoom back out on like the lessons and everything, I was just looking over some feedback from a school I was working with. And there's one thing I would just name for every stakeholder in the charter space right now. And that is any school that is going out and talking to prospective families is likely finding out that those families, one, have misperceptions about what charter schools are, two, don't know that they exist, or three, some iteration that know that they exist but don't really know who they are and what they do. And so I would still argue that like we have to assume most people still know very little about charter schools in general.
Yep.
And that even if they have improved awareness, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to become participants within the charter school space or want their kids to attend one. And even folks that have their kids that go to schools that have high levels of awareness, when probed, they're like not really familiar with the fact that, again, we're public, tuition free, open to all entities. And so as we think about the landscape, and I appreciate you mentioned this idea that anything can be borrowed, the charter sector, I mean, I attended public schools my entire life. I'm a very proud graduate of Denver Public Schools. I want public entities to thrive and exist because it will be good for society as a whole. And at the end of the day, the charter network writ large nationwide is a huge entity. Mm-hmm. And it can still be leveraged and organized. And I would say any charter school, again, if you have a ginormous waiting list versus if you're struggling with enrollment, everybody should be engaging with prospective families about who we are and what we do and how we're looking to serve students towards a better future. Because as much as we think we've done it to our fullest extent, the data is very clear that we have not. And if we lead with student messengers and alumni voices, and as much as we lead with like parents and teachers, we're likely going to find a lot of resonance towards that end.
Fundamentally educating people and not assuming understanding or knowledge of the charter community or what a charter school offers. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and we have 2 charter schools in Richmond. They're both K-5 small schools. And when I talk to people about my work, very few people know what a charter school is, when you ask a couple of the basic questions. So I think you're absolutely right. Tons of opportunity still to serve students and families in the way that charter schools are doing all across the country. And certainly in starting a new community engagement process or strategy, if you don't know where to start, maybe just start by thinking about how do we educate people on that we exist and what we
Yeah.
are and how we're a little bit different. You can't go wrong there.
Yeah.
So,
Can I make one last final plug? I'm just like thinking about the potential audience
please.
here. So thinking about my time as a school leader, one of the biggest mistakes I made is I overassumed that it was my burden to carry and I had to have all the answers. And I would argue that if you're not sure where to start, there are state entities that exist in most states that support charter schools, similar to like what we do here at the League of Charter Schools. Most of these entities have individuals whose primary role is to support schools with enrollments, with growth, with expansion. And, if you're not already interfacing with them, I would look up who they are and what they do and then how they interface. If your state doesn't have that or isn't engaging the right way, again, like I'd be happy to engage in a conversation. Again, the Colorado League of Charter Schools, Daniel, we obviously talked about our connection with the origin of BIQ in the league. But I would just say that please leverage the wisdom that is out there. Most of this is learned and learnable. It is not just some organic, like wisdom that you have to find through the fire. There's a huge community of folks who have a ton of knowledge and information. Happy to play both the role of a connector and just hope that folks can find the answers that they're looking for so that we can continue to navigate a very challenging space.
Love it. So, Bill, where should people go to learn more about your work and the work that the league is doing if someone's listening and they're at a charter school in Colorado?
So here in Colorado, I'm sure many of you know, but please go to coloradoleague.org. We run a number of cohorts around marketing, around enrollment. We also run conferences. We have a leadership summit coming up here in October on the 9th at Le Meridian downtown, and then we have our annual conference. These are highly attended events where we do a lot of in-person work around, anything from board governance to HR policies, to enrollment and marketing, because again, we just know it's such a top of mind issue for folks. We do engage with a lot of schools. Right now I'm working with 6 different schools doing some one-to-one consulting and supporting them with their challenges. That kind of work, is why we exist, and we're just looking to continue to support folks that are already in communities that are looking to grow into communities, and we're very, very hopeful that families here in Colorado continue to have access to high quality options. The data, as I'm sure many people just saw, just came out about school performance, and while many schools have grown in both CMAS, PSAT, and SAT, there are still a lot of quality deserts and choice deserts, and so our mission is going to remain the same. We're going to continue to promote and push that and hope that all families in Colorado have multiple options and choices as they navigate their children's future.
And if I'm a charter school leader who doesn't live in Colorado, but I found this episode really interesting and helpful, and I want to connect with you personally, Bill, how should people find you?
Yeah, again, please feel free to email me. It is bknous, Knous, at coloradoleague.org. You can also find all of our info on the Colorado League website. I would also plug the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools is a really, really great organization, the Charter School Growth Fund. And there's also some other really big entities. So start by Googling, but if anybody wants to reach out, happy to connect. Always here to be of service to the missions that exist to support students. So Daniel, really appreciate the time and the opportunity to share some of the wisdom that I've been fortunate enough to gain, and hopeful that other folks can continue to push, what is right, I think best for kids, which is going to be choice to access and opportunity.
Awesome. No better place to wrap than there. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Daniel. Take good care.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BIQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting biq.org/sign-up. BIQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@biq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.